everybody. I'm Zanny Minton-Meadows, editor of The Economist, and I am delighted to welcome you to the fourth Helen Alexander Memorial Lecture. For the past 4 years, Helen's family and the organizations with which she was associated, The Economist Group, the CBI, Informa, and the University of Southampton, have come together to celebrate Helen's extraordinary legacy as a role model for women in business by hearing from a prominent female business leader. This event has become, for me, and I think for many of you, a really very special date on the calendar. One I think Helen would have enjoyed and been proud of. We've heard from a pretty extraordinary group of outstanding leaders: Christine Lagarde, Carolyn McCall, Emma Walmsley, and tonight I'm delighted to say that we're going to continue this tradition in a conversation with another remarkable female business leader, Dame Sharon White, chairman of the John Lewis Partnership. Sharon, who became the partnership's sixth chairman in February 2020, steers what you all know is one of Britain's iconic businesses. Founded by John Speed and Lewis, I think nearly a century ago, John Lewis is Britain's largest employee-owned business. It's the quintessential purpose-driven business. Its founding ethos was to combine successful commercial enterprise with a democratic structure that gives every employee, or partner, as they are called, a voice and a stake. In fact, John Lewis, I think, has become so iconic that many people across this country, far beyond its partners, feel not only that they know it well, but that they have a special stake in it. But Sharon's not just a remarkable business leader. Before she took this job, she was a long-standing and enormously successful leader in the civil service. She came having been chief executive of Ofcom, Britain's UK's communications regulator, and before that she was the second permanent secretary at the Treasury. Her storied civil service career has taken her to several continents, including Washington 30 years ago, which is actually where I first came across Sharon. And I have to say that in the last 30 years, I've had many conversations with Sharon, and they have one thing in common: that not a single one of them has been boring. So I hope and I expect that you are in for a great treat. Sharon, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And I wanted to start by asking you, which I think lots of people must have asked themselves when you took this job in February 2020, why did one of Britain's foremost public servants decide to become chairman of John Lewis?
So first of all, Zanny, it's brilliant to see you, and having been to the first lecture with Christine Lagarde, I'm feeling that I've got sort of rather large shoes to fill tonight. So it's a great honour to be here. I think the sort of kind phrase that was used about my appointment was this sort of the unconventional choice, I think, for an unconventional business. So do you say, I mean, I've been in the public sector for 30 years thereabouts. And, when I got a call asking whether I was sort of interested in throwing my hat into the ring, I mean, I have to say, first of all, I was, rather surprised and, thought maybe they got me confused with somebody else who, had a very sort of long retail background. But I was really intrigued. And I was intrigued not just because, I've been a customer of both brands for a long time, but the drive is very much the, it's the model. And as you said in your opening, Zanny, the partnership is the biggest employee-owned business in the UK, one of the biggest in the world. Had started off with this sort of, what seemed at the time almost as a bonkers idea that, John Speed and Lewis company he'd sort of semi-inherited from his father, the original John Lewis, had this great vision, which was to give the company away. And, more than a century later, we're still operating as an employee-owned business with purpose right at the centre. And as somebody who spent, all their career, very much in what I would call sort of purpose-led businesses, even the Treasury, where it's very much about how do you sort of serve the public interest. Being part of a business where it's about sort of combining, commercial success, but with doing the right thing is a sort of intoxicating, fascinating, intriguing combination.
So what, almost 2 years on, do you think of this quintessential purpose-led business? And now pretty much every company has a purpose. You have to have a purpose now, and if companies don't have a formal purpose, they quickly are getting one, because it's terribly important to be a purpose-led company now. And some of those purposes, I think, are a little more than kind of marketing ploys. But in this case, it really is genuine. So what's it like? How does it drive the business? How does it affect your life?
No, it's a great question. So the purpose of the partnership. So we have a constitution, unlike almost any other business, and that is the happiness of partners, worthwhile, satisfying work in a commercially successful business. Which I think is extraordinary. So that you start as a business driven by your partners being happy, and obviously the last 2 years, nobody could have quite predicted the tumult that not just retail but the whole economy has been through. So as you say, I started in February. I think I had about sort of 4 weeks, did end of year results, and then about 2 weeks later we were about to sort of go into lockdown. And the purpose of the partnership, so this sense that every partner feels that they own the business, have a stake in the business. The focus, I would say, on there's an extraordinary thing in the partnership, which is about somehow handing on the partnership to future generations of partners. You see and you feel every day. So if I look at the crisis over the last year, John Lewis stores closed, open 3 times over the course of the year. We had 4,500 John Lewis partners who could have gone on furlough, decided to volunteer to work alongside their partners in Waitrose to bring the business through, as all supermarkets were sort of focusing on feeding the nation. Whereas if you were, branches that I visited early on in the crisis, and you'd sort of ask about, are there any loo rolls on the shelves? And actually, all the conversations were around, supporting each other and supporting the community. So, with the branches who were, making packed lunches for the local schools which were still operating because, they were taking in the children of, parents who were essential workers. So that sort of what I would call communitarian spirit, it's like nothing I have seen in any other organisation I've worked. And even with some, obviously, well documented, some very difficult and some very painful decisions over the last year and a half. I've had partners on the day in which they are, their last day in the business, writing, dear Sharon, hope you're settling in well. It's my last day today after maybe 30 or 40 years in the business. I've just spent the last night just writing down a new plan for the business, because here were 25 ideas for how to ensure that the business continues and the business thrives. So that purpose and that sense of history, it's intoxicating. It really drives partners to go, we talk about going above and beyond, and you see that every day.
Talk a bit about those difficult decisions, because you have had to make some tough ones in the past year and a half. I mean, you've closed several stores, you've made many people redundant. Has it been harder to do that? I mean, is it more difficult to take what you know to be the right commercial decision because of the partnership?
So it has definitely been tough. We've it has felt not just that retail has moved 10 years in the last 18 months, but we've probably sort of concertinaed 10 years of change within the partnership in 18 months. And I would say any change is painful for any business, but in a partnership where good work, good pay, progression, I would also say a sense of family and connectedness, I think has made the decisions and the impact definitely, incredibly tough. I've been to, when we've announced closures of stores, and I've been along to see the group of partners, and it does feel as though you're sort of breaching familial relationships, even though there is such a strong understanding of the rationale, and there's a very strong sense and passion that the partnership needs to survive. But yes, I would say it's definitely tougher.
And does it affect decision making? I mean, it's Speed and Lewis was very focused on kind of democracy in the firm, on having a way for partners to make their voices heard. Do you have to have? I mean, how kind of consensus driven and sort of communitarian is it? I mean, how much are those decisions decentralized? How much do you have to get everybody on board, or is it really a kind of traditionally run business where the C-suite basically decides what to do?
So it's a great question. So for those who are listening in, we're also a very historic democracy. So we have our own council, which operates 60 members elected by partners, operates a little bit like the House of Commons. So twice a year, they hold me as chairman to account, and there's a vote every 6 months on whether I still have the confidence of partners to continue in the role. And then below the council, there are forums, there are what we call sort of local voices. So every bit of the business is able to sort of elect representatives, either sort of serving their interests locally or across the partnership. And what's fantastic is your sense of partner opinion on any topic at any time of the day is always incredibly clear. So we take a decision, always having a debate in the partnership, and the degree of feedback, and some of it's really tough. So you talked about, are we incredibly consensual? Obviously, with any decision you take, you're trying to basically maximise the well-being, the future of the partnership, but also partners' happiness. And obviously, there are decisions where those two things aren't always in concert. So this question about how you have a debate with full knowledge and sharing financial information and trying to have sort of an open and honest conversation with partners, while also getting a tremendous amount of real-time feedback. So, I will do a blog and get hundreds of bits of feedback. We've got a weekly newspaper, the Gazette. Again, any partner in any part of the business can write into the Gazette, sometimes anonymously, with their feedback. So it's an organisation where there is a very, very strong focus on freedom of speech, where the board absolutely tries to get decisions lined up with partner opinion. 3 governing authorities, so our council, chairman and board, working in close alignment. But also there are obviously sometimes you've got to take a decision that is not necessarily well loved today, but is absolutely essential for the partnership to continue and thrive into future years.
And how broad does this debate go? Because one of the many areas that lots of businesses are now grappling with are kind of do businesses have a political role on both sides of the Atlantic? There's a lot of discussion of if employees feel very strongly, partners in your case feel strongly about something that isn't really necessarily directly John Lewis related, but whether it's the issue of race, or whether it's the issue of gender, or whether it's the environment, or any number of hot button issues. Do you encourage that, and how do you sort of take back that feedback?
As the business, it's another really good question. It's also a very difficult topic, I think, for us and for many other businesses. So we've had this very, very strong culture of freedom of speech. So somebody coming new into people coming new into the partnership are sometimes surprised by by the sharpness of the feedback, but also the openness of the debate, which I think is incredibly healthy. The question about when does my freedom of speech become your offence? So the partnership in some ways is incredibly politically involved and politically engaged. In some ways, the very model itself is quasi-political. John Speed and Lewis explicitly saw the partnership as an alternative to communism, that you would set up a business that had such strong benefits, healthcare, education, that there was no reason for you after the war essentially to sort of move to the communist side. So it has its roots in quite a sort of quasi-political space. And partners are incredibly keen for us to be even more active in debates like the environment, ethics, the right way of running the business. But there are obviously topics which get to be very difficult. So with the murder of George Floyd last year, we, like lots of other businesses, have had I would say very important but quite challenging debate about Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. Is the partnership, so we like lots of other businesses went quite public in our support for Black Lives Matter, quite a lot of internal debate as to whether that's the right thing to do, how that fits in with our values around diversity and inclusivity. Probably much tougher debates in some other areas around Palestine and Israel, and when do issues of political topicality, political controversy, when do they fit with the partnership because they're about our inclusivity, our diversity, and when are there topics which are essentially which should sit outside the partnership sort of walls and perimeter, has been a very difficult debate for us, which, to be frank, we're still navigating.
And how do you lead through that? How do you determine the kind of appropriate parameters of that debate? I mean, these are really thorny issues, and they're thorny issues where, on some of them, people increasingly, often find the other side's view not just something they disagree with, but they think it is a view that it is, is an unconscionable view. So how do you, if you have all this vibrant, fizzing, perhaps very angry debate, what's your role there? Do you have your own strong moral position on these issues and you lay it out, or do you feel that you need to kind of get the mood of the organization? How do you lead that?
So I think again, it's a really important question to which I think we're still sort of navigating our path. So my own view has been, and this is probably from my sort of media regulator days as well, has been really to try to encourage as much sort of freedom of expression, freedom of speech and debate up until the point at which it clearly, from popular opinion, becomes, my freedom of speech and expression becomes somebody else's offence. So I probably lean much more instinctively, if you're bringing your whole self to work, these are debates that's hard to have very, very firm boundaries between, yourself outside work and in work. At the same time, we know that some of the debates have caused some real sort of soul searching within the partnership about whether we are being sufficiently respectful, sufficiently courteous, sufficiently in line with our values, even as we have debates over over issues which are quite controversial. And that's still being worked through. I would say the debate's probably noisier this year than it was last year, and that may simply be because we're all, everybody's a bit more sort of fractious because of the pandemic, and some of these issues are coming more to the surface. You can see it externally with social media. So for me, it's how can we create a culture which is which sort of continues to encourage and foster freedom of speech and expression in the debates, but also in a courteous and respectful way.
And is it your sense that, I mean, this is clearly a sort of an absolutely central pillar of John Lewis, but does it strengthen the organization, that sense of freedom of speech, or does it foster, anger and dissent? I mean, there are some companies, in Silicon Valley, a few companies are basically saying, we're not going to be a political company, so keep the conversation at work to subjects at work. And then there's another equally or respectable view, which is actually people are, as you say, bringing their whole selves to work, and therefore it's not only reasonable but of course understandable that people would want to have discussions and would want their companies to stand for something.
So we're trying, as I say, it's a fuzzy line, but we're trying to steer the line between sort of topics which are overtly political outside the partnership, but then there are obviously debates which have got some political flavours, whether it's around climate change, whether it's around inclusivity, where we are trying to foster that debate internally. I would say that where it works, actually having a culture which is about speaking truth to power, and that sense in which as a Democrat, it doesn't matter whether you're chairman or you're a member of the board or whether you're a partner who's just come in as a sort of Christmas job in, John Lewis Oxford Street and have only been in the business for 2 or 3 months, that your voice counts equally, and that you've got things to say, and there are routes and channels for you to put forward your point of view. I think that is incredibly strengthening for the partnership, and I think was one of the great insights of the founder, John Speed and Lewis, that that rather than suppress dissent and suppress concerns and suppress criticism, finding respectful channels for every partner to be able to, voice what's on their mind. Even though some days the criticism can be sticky, I think it's incredibly powerful.
But it's criticism and it's debate through the newspaper, through all of these channels. But is there an expectation that you will act on it? So it really is more than just a channel for voicing dissent. It is a means for if enough partners feel strongly about something, action will be taken.
Yeah, so the whole point of the democracy is that partner opinion is, we talk about partner opinion being sovereign as part of the constitution. So as a leader or people manager in the business, an incredibly important part of the role as somebody who is managing fellow Democrats is to listen and to respond. Now, part of the response may well be, explanation and empathy as to why, the particular path has been chosen, which is why, again, what John Speed and Lewis talked about is sharing of knowledge. So partners being having more information than you would find a shareholder in a traditional PLC about the state of the business, the finances. If we do a pay review, what are some of the choices and trade-offs? When I do results now, I write the letter to partners, not to the outside world, because principally it's about partners understanding the business and having the context into which they are then, raising concerns or questions or, responding favourably. Very much a work in progress, I have to say, but that's when it works, it's a fantastic thing.
But now put your former hat on of a policymaker. Is this a model, which is an extraordinary model, just hearing you describe it, is it a model that you think is a model that more companies should follow? This has been a long debate. Should employee-owned companies, is that a better model of capitalism? Having been up close now, do you think that's true?
So I think it's an extraordinary model. And I think it's a model that has extraordinary strengths in terms of the passion and the dedication from partners, employees, the ability to think and act longer term, be more innovative, etc. I would never talk about the partnership as being the model or the one model or the best model for other businesses, but I think it's really interesting as you see other businesses moving into this purpose space, that in different ways they are taking steps to this sort of communitarian principle. So whether that's more focus on the environment, I mean, whether it's seeing ESG starting to form part of the remuneration of many, in many PLC around the board table, those steps which say, which for us are very explicit, which is about making sufficient profit. So for us, it's really about making enough money to do good, enough money to invest back in partners, enough money to do things in the community, enough money to fight climate change. And you do you do get a degree of motivation and focus on the business that I think is very hard to see in a traditional private or traditional PLC. So, would I love us both to be more commercially successful and more purposeful, and would I love us to see other companies at this sort of scale? I mean, it would be fantastic.
But if you ever have to choose, and if you're ever, and I'm going to put this crudely, but if you're ever choosing between profit and your purpose, which one do you go for?
So I don't, so I think it's very hard to see these things as a trade, because if we were to make a decision that was entirely for a profit-driven rationale, her partners could not see the purpose link. You're dead in the water.
Okay, well, let's put that in a concrete example, because we're now in a world where the post-pandemic world, retail is changing unbelievably quickly. The workplace, the nature of the workplace is changing. We've got enormous supply chain issues, which I'll come to in a minute, because I suspect everybody on this call wants to know whether John Lewis is going to have empty shelves at Christmas or not. But the world is shifting, and you're shifting, right? You're moving into financial services, you're becoming landlords, you're renting out many of your stores. I mean, these are big decisions that are being made with understandably with your bottom line in mind. I mean, how have you thought those through, given this prism of being employee owned and purpose driven?
So it all starts with purpose. So if we were not a partnership, if we were not an employee owned business, then we would be aiming to maximize as much cash as we possibly could from our retail brands, and we've got amazing brands. But the very fact that certainly why I've come to the partnership, the very fact that what we're aiming for is that there's still a partnership in 100 years' time, and there's still a partnership that can meet all the ambitions, which at the moment we're not able to meet because our commercial performance isn't strong enough, whether that's paying everybody the real living wage or being even more assertive on net zero. And we know that the margins in retail over a 10, 15, 20-year period are not going to support the sorts of investments and those purpose-led, purpose-driven aspirations. So the very fact that we are looking to diversify is rooted directly in the fact that we're a partnership. And indeed, again, if you go back in our history, the idea was always that we would be a very diversified business because we don't have any external shareholders. We're financially independent, and so you've always got to, ensure that you're sort of managing a portfolio of business and business interests. So thinking about financial services, and we're looking to do it in an ethical way and looking to be a sort of trusted service for our customers. Housing, again, we've been a landlord for a very long time because originally the partnership provided housing for partners who couldn't afford a roof over their head, for retired partners who didn't have a long-term pension. So we've got many houses already in a village in Hampshire, in fact. So some of this, again, I often talk about looking back to look forward. So we've really thought about how's the partnership thriving? Brilliant retail brands, but we've got to build on those brands to do even more for our customers, so that we can, make all the investments in all the ways that we'd love to, but are company constrained.
So one last question before I open to lots of questions from others, which is you've now spent nearly 2 years at the top of this remarkable business after your career in government. Do you think about government differently now after 2 years in the private sector?
Gosh, so that's a really hard question. I think
better or worse?
I mean, the comparisons, the fact that we operate a democracy means that actually that there were so many parallels between my previous life and my new life. That sense of, previously I was very much accountable to taxpayers in all the roles I did, and the slightly sort of dreaded appearances at the Public Accounts Committee, but rightly, standing up and giving an account for your decisions or your support for decisions that were taken by politicians. And today it feels just as important, even though it's slightly more local, because I'm accountable to sort of 80,000 partners and ultimately 19 million customers. I mean, I've always respected government. It's an incredibly tough job, and as I think about what it's been like leading a retailer through COVID, actually I'm personally very positive, particularly about my former colleagues at the Treasury, who I think have done a really rather good job in terms of the sort of COVID support and helping to keep businesses alive through the last 2 years.
Those diplomatic skills that served you so well in the civil service are absolutely at the answer. But I'm going to push you further, because I know that you probably have stronger views than that, which is, and let's put it on one specific point, which is the supply chain issue, and the fact that some of your stock is not as full as many of your customers would like, and too often when you go on the John Lewis website, there's stuff that isn't there. How much of that is government's fault?
So it's a combination of things. So we have got, COVID has meant that we have got shipping containers that should be in the Far East that have been stuck in North America, which has meant that we've been hiring our own ships, hiring more ships and hiring them early to produce, to get the Christmas stock and Christmas baubles. I mean, no doubt every retailer has had what I would call labour supply issues, in a way in which I have to say 6 months ago, if you'd asked me what the issues were going to be with the labour market, I would never have said that we would, it's about having too few people and wages rising. The opposite. Clearly, more workers available to, I have to say, particularly at the moment, to operate warehouses would make Christmas planning rather less stressful than it is currently.
But what about the argument that is made by some, and you'll know who I mean, that if only you paid a decent wage, you'd be able to hire, and low wage immigration is not the answer?
So I mean, wages are rising in all the shortage areas. So HGV drivers, we introduced sign-on bonuses of £5,000 in the summer, and it's mostly that issue has now been pretty resolved for us. But we're finding that even as we are paying more, we're still not able to hire quite as many people as we'd like, even though we're going hard and fast.
So put your civil servant hat on again. What's the best policy to sort this out?
I mean, it's October, so it's not many weeks away from Christmas. So we are, it comes back a little bit to being a business of purpose. We are, selling ourselves in the market as a business that you can work for, not only for decent pay and benefits, but also you're working for a different sort of business. So I would focus on the purpose attributes of your business in order to try to attract those scarce warehouse workers before Christmas peak recruitment is over.
That's for you, but what about for the government? Are there policies that should be done now, things that should be done to ease this?
I think I mean, for Christmas, we're getting quite late in the day. I think, the visa changes on HGV drivers obviously were very welcome. Whether the government continues to look in that zone, we would be very supportive of. But as I say, we've probably got about another two to 3 weeks of peak Christmas recruitment. So whatever action is going to be taken, it's not a huge amount of time.
So are we going to be able to get our Christmas crackers at John Lewis?
You'll get your Christmas crackers. They've
all right. Well, with that,
arrived at port.
Oh, excellent. That's the that's the most important thing you've said all evening. That's great. Let's turn now to some questions. And to those of you in the audience, you can participate in the Q&A by submitting a question via the questions box in the control panel. And when we turn to your question, the webinar team will unmute you so that you can ask your question in person. Or if you want me to read out your question, you can just say that you'd like it to be read out. These are not under Chatham House rules. We have got media in attendance. But first, I'm going to start with a few questions that were submitted in advance by students from Southampton. And the first one, Sharon, is from Sukriti, who says, the topic of female leadership in the mathematical sciences is the focus of my dissertation at Southampton. I'm curious, what would you advise the future generation of women leaders about the challenges and opportunities they may face ahead?
Gosh, that's a big question. So thanks so much for the question, and it sounds like an extraordinary topic of study, and I guess pleased to know that there are also more women who are now studying mathematical sciences. I guess a few things, if I just talk very personally. So when I joined the Treasury in 1989, which I can't quite believe quite how long ago this was, it was, you know, there were probably more cleaners and people working at reception than there were who were women than there were female professional economists. And one of the things that I found unbelievably helpful was the network of other women. And obviously the network grew as the numbers of women grew. And all through my life, those conversations where, you know, you're in a meeting, you think, gosh, did I quite hear that? Did I quite witness that? Do you think I could have handled that in a slightly different way? And even to this day, even though I've been out of the civil service a little while, that network of other women who are possibly going in the same sort of lockstep as you is something that I found sort of deeply valuable. I've always also been at various stages involved in, you know, how do you encourage more women into the profession, and this may be true for you in mathematical sciences. And just focusing, one of the big things that proved to be so important was just focusing on the data, which I know for Helen Alexander was a big thing too. So there was this sort of sense in which, you know, opportunities were open between the genders equally, until we did a very sort of structured analysis of, you know, who was applying for jobs, what were their rates of success, what were the differences in promotion prospects, what were the social and economic differences in background. And over the course of 20 years, and it did take 20 years, certainly in the civil service, the numbers were transformed. And when I left the Treasury, you know, 45% of the department was female. So I would say opportunities, networks, and that group of women who can go lockstep with you in your career, I think super important. I think being very mindful of how the profession is progressing, and how you use that data actually also to build, you know, support amongst your male colleagues as well. I think for me, those two things have been super important.
Thank you. We have a question now from Cindy. In fact, two questions, but the first I think you've actually really answered, which is what can women do to support their own career development? But she has another question. Are there any patterns of behavior they should avoid?
I mean, I know it's the cliche about being yourself. So I, for years, I used to be sort of, the feedback I always used to get was that I was sort of, you know, I was insufficiently an alpha male, and I, you know, wasn't sufficiently sort of, you know, directive of conversations. And because I tend to be somebody who likes to build consensus, I tend to be somebody who likes to sort of develop networks and to see how issues arise and see how solutions can arrive in a quite a sort of collective and collaborative way. And I used to think, well, gosh, you know, maybe everybody's got it right, and I need to somehow sort of develop this sort of slightly more sort of A-type personality. And actually, there is something about recognizing your strengths and what makes you fantastic and what makes you effective, and building on that, and getting great feedback from your colleagues, that for me was a real unlock probably when I hit my mid-30s. So my great advice would be, what will make you great, and build on your own particular strengths, rather than looking to avoid or ape behaviours of others.
We've got a great follow-on question to that from Molly, who asks, how has working in a male-dominated business culture, such as the management role you're in, impacted your mental well-being? Has it caused a lack of confidence, or has it enhanced your positivity and determination? I think I can answer that.
Yeah, I'm very glass half full. I think I mean, it's quite interesting in the last year and a half, even since I've been at the partnership, that obviously we've had quite a lot of change of both our board and our executive team. And actually it's also been an opportunity to just widen the diversity of the team. So the very nice thing about, being in my position is that, you can affect change. So we're now majority female at our executive committee level and majority female at our board level. And, it's great for the rest of the business. I mean, we're a majority of female, but mostly more junior roles, and most of our leadership has been more male over the years. What's great is that we've now got different models of leadership in different sizes and shapes and colours and genders than perhaps we've had before. And I'm finding my mental health is doing really pretty well, thank you.
Excellent. And last question from Southampton is from Laura, who asks, how can new graduates like my fellow Southampton students stand out in the workplace, particularly given the volatile job market post-Brexit and as we recover from the pandemic? Do you think that changing jobs is important, or is it better to enjoy a longer duration at one company?
So I am a great believer that you've got to have fun. So I'm one, as Danny will know, I'm one end of the spectrum, because although I spent a long time in the civil service, I moved jobs a lot. So I've done lots of very different things. I've worked different departments, I've worked domestically, I've worked internationally, I've worked for a regulator, and now I'm in a business. So occasionally I think, gosh, maybe I should have been much more sensible and, really developed an anchor. But I think, we're all going to be working, I'm sure, working until you're 70. None of us are going to retire ever again. There are no pensions. And it's really important that whatever job you're doing, you can look yourself in the mirror and think, this is fantastically interesting and fun, and I love the people I'm working with. And you can see a sense of purpose. So I don't think it's as simple as saying move around a lot or develop a career anchor. I think it is for you knowing what is going to stimulate you, knowing what is going to knowing what's going to get into a place where it doesn't feel like work. And with your education, your background, all the skills you're going to bring, you're luckier than many people that you'll have more choice and more agency. So I would I'd kind of focus on what's going to be most fun, rather than necessarily focus on necessarily what you think is the right sort of career move from a CV point of view.
Focus on what's going to be the most fun. I think that's actually extraordinarily good advice. Do stay with what you are really enjoying and makes you feel as though you're doing something worthwhile and purposeful. With that, we're going to open to the broader questions, and let's start with Mark Spearing, who has a question. Is our tech working so that we can hear Mark?
Oh, I think I can now. Hi there.
Hello, Mark. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Sharon, Zandy, great conversation. Loved it. Actually, I asked two questions, but I'll ask the first. I saw lots of parallels to a university in how you had described the John Lewis partnership, and I'm at the University of Southampton. Do you have a view as to why relatively few businesses have adopted a partnership model over the last 100 years that looks anything like the John Lewis one? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I've been very thoughtful about, because there are actually a relatively large number of employee-owned businesses, but just not of our scale. And sometimes I'm quite thoughtful about how much it took for John Speed and Lewis even to set up the partnership, because his father, John Lewis, was essentially the Jeff Bezos of his day. He set up John Lewis as almost like an Amazon, incredibly profitable, and basically had to take a sort of early inheritance, and took him almost sort of 4 decades fully. It wasn't until 1950 that he formally signed the last sort of trust settlement, the last piece of rule book, to hand the partnership over to partners, over to employees. And I suspect it's because it's still quite countercultural that that the business is owned by the people who work there, that remuneration, that your bonus is this, equiproportionate, same proportion, doesn't matter where you are in the business. As I say, communitarian principles that perhaps don't always fit smoothly or happily with individual incentive. It's a very, I call it sort of socialist capitalism. There's a very strong sense of common solidarity. So as I say, you see it in pockets, and you see it often where a founder hands on a business to his or her employees where there's no clear family succession. But fascinating, as you say, that we haven't seen it at scale. So maybe it's, to say, maybe it's sort of counter to many of our sort of human endemic sort of intrinsic instincts.
The next question, I think, is one for me to read out, which is, are there any particular benefits in terms of experience and skills that arise from your slightly unusual move from the public sector to the private retail sector?
So I think, if I was sitting here as chief executive of WH Smith, I think you'd be very worried. I think that the difference with the partnership is that the ethos is so very strongly similar to public service. So obviously we are, a great retailer and great commercial, great commercial operation, but actually the culture of the business is incredibly synergistic with the public service. So I often think if I had been a traditional retailer with a traditional retailing background and a turnaround background, coming into the partnership would have had more cultural dissonance than coming with my background, because partners know that ultimately the reason I'm in the business is because I care passionately about the model and about the partnership. I'm not there because I'm uninterested in, obviously I want us to be commercially successful, but I'm not in the business because I'm there to make the business lots of money, but I'm there to try and work with partners so that we can make enough money to do great things. So it is, I would say, it's about culture and values make it a much less, to be frank, unconventional CV and a much easier transition, paradoxically, than perhaps somebody who had a more sort of traditional retail CV.
Well, that leads perfectly on to the next question, which is from Gus O'Donnell, and is predictably direct. Is he there? Gus, it says I should read it, but Gus, would you like to say it yourself? I think I'll read it. It's great. Which job is harder, chair of John Lewis or permanent secretary at Her Majesty's Treasury?
Oh, chair of John Lewis, partnership.
And why?
It's both amazing jobs. The partnership, I'd say, for you are more, it's a much more publicly exposed position being at the partnership. And Zanny, you said the amazing thing is the partnership has got such a totemic place in British society, and everybody wants you to succeed is wonderful, and customers love you, but it does make it a much more, it's a public job. And when I was in the public sector, however difficult negotiations were, essentially your income, so when you think about your P&L, your income's from the taxpayer, and of course you're accountable for that. We can only spend the money that we are able with purpose to make from our customers. So my Sunday night reading of the trading update in both brands is, I always find, a slightly more stressful than the days of figuring out whether we spent taxpayers' money so appropriately or not. And it's the degree of responsibility. So I feel very responsible for 80,000 partners, and I feel very responsible for 20 million customers.
The next question is from Simon Fanshawe, who I think is going to ask it live. Simon?
Hi. Look, thanks for this. It's really, really fascinating. I wanted to pursue a bit more the democracy of the company, because what happens when within the partners you have, and we've had some recent experience of this in the UK, a kind of 52-48 situation? So you say, you know, you're there at the behest of the partners and you have to answer, or at least you have to carry out what they want. But when what they want is entirely contradictory, or at least in disagreement with each other, can you take us a little bit through the mechanism that you then use, the nature of the executive or the board decision that you would go through in order to reach a decision? I mean, clearly you have to bring people along, but how do you reach that decision given they're sort of divided?
Yes, again, it's a really interesting question, obviously, particularly given the moment we're in with a lot of change. So the council's role formally is to shape and influence policy and influence decision making, as well as to hold the chairman to account. So you would recognise from our board decisions the sorts of things that you would expect us to be taking decisions on, whether that's pay review or bonus or you know, store closures and so on. How we try to square the circle is through communication and engagement and sharing knowledge and having the debate with council. And I would say we're not doing it perfectly at all, and we've had lots of great feedback from council about how we can and should be engaging with partners more. But if council and the executive and the chairman and the board have got the same information about the financial context, the market context, have got the same vision and same purpose about where we all want the company to be moving towards, it does then at least set a sort of common context for the decisions that are taken. And of course, what you often see is that variety of opinion across the partnership. When it works well, what is fascinating is actually partners debating with other partners. Yes. So I always think about it almost as a self-correcting mechanism. So you there are times when almost the chairman's almost irrelevant. You're standing on the sideline because actually the debate about whether a particular course of action is the right one or the wrong one, whether we're supporting partners in the right way, actually you often get both sides of the argument within the partner body, and they debate and when it works well, reach a common purpose or common direction together. But it's like all democracies, it's messy.
Yes, well, that's a great conclusion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It is a great conclusion. I wish I could ask. I have so many more questions I'd like to ask you, but we are, alas, coming close to the witching hour. So Sharon, thank you. But I am going to ask one last question before I turn to Tony Danker at the CBI, because you've been there now almost 2 years, but you've very compellingly explained to us how you think about what sustains the partnership, for the long haul, decades, 100 years, which, to a 178-year-old magazine is music to our ears. We like to think the same kind of way. So tell us what it's going to look like at John Lewis Partnership in, let's say, I don't know, 100 years, 10 years time. What's it going to be like?
Right. So 10 years time, we are financially sustainable. We are paying every partner the real living wage and above. We have got an amazing skills academy that retraining partners into new ways of working. We've hired many more people from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly those who've been looked after from the care sector. We have been able to be much more assertive on the environment, particularly thinking about the circular economy for John Lewis. So everything you can think of purchasing, you could also rent, reuse, recycle. And Waitrose is an even more sustainable brand, and we are also knocking on your door to sell you amazing ethical savings and investment products. And fingers crossed, 10 years time, we may have built 10,000 homes, again with sustainability and transparency with the landlord that perhaps you might not see elsewhere.
Well, that's a pretty upbeat and rather wonderful vision to end this bit on. Thank you very much, Sharon. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Tony Danker of the CBI.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm just trying to get camera now.
We can hear you loud and clear.
That was tremendously embarrassing. If you want something to work well, get the women to do it, because the men always mess up in the end, let's be honest. But look, it's my job to try and wrap up. And look, I just want to start by mentioning Helen, of course. And I only met Helen once or twice, but so I don't know and didn't know her well. But it's quite interesting because we are currently beginning our search for the next CBI president. So we do it every 2 years. We have a new CBI president. And I've spoken to a few people, and they always turn around and go, archetype, yeah, you could do with Helen Alexander again. And so although we all feel that we lost Helen Alexander, in some ways we're still looking for her at the CBI. So I was really honored to be asked to close this evening. And what fabulous leaders we've been listening to the last hour. And Sharon is a truly inspirational leader. I was on the inside of this to some degree, because I was working with Charlie Mayfield when they were doing the search for his successor. And I kept asking Charlie, who's it going to be? And he wouldn't tell me. But he kept turning around to me and saying, you know, it's about true leadership. And this is a true leader. And I think he was trying to preempt with me the accusation of, well, she doesn't come from retail. But he kept on saying this is true leadership and a true leader. And Sharon, I think we've seen some of that this evening. And Zani, a shout out for you, if I may. I wish you could moderate everything that I watched. And The Economist continues, just look, if The Economist stands for insight in a very confusing world, my goodness, you have given us lots of that. I also quite enjoyed you asking Sharon all the difficult questions that I've been asked by journalists for the last 2 weeks about what's going on, and I could just sit back and listen to someone else answer them. So that was enjoyable. But look, you know, I was listening to Sharon and I wrote down the words, and it's right here. I wrote down the words "back to the future" just before you said looking back to look forward. And there's something really interesting has happened as a result of the pandemic, which I think makes John Lewis more relevant than ever, which is, you know, trust in business has gone up in the last year. And when you work out why, it's because employees feel that their employers stood behind their well-being during the crisis. And of course, that is a model that John Lewis and Speed and Lewis came up with 100 years ago. And I think what we've learned from the pandemic, together with, you know, what millennial workforce demand of us, actually we're talking about a new social contract of employment as a very new idea for companies of all sizes. And yet for Sharon, it's a very old idea and one they're continuing to invest in. I wrote down a few quotes, which I thought were great on John Lewis: happiness of partners, sufficient profit. We could have a big debate about that as an idea. The idea that perpetuity or legacy drives diversifying the business, which I thought was really interesting, and bringing the debate in, but also thinking about respect and kindness. And Sharon, also when you talked about women in business, particularly in response to some of the students, the role of network and what that had been for you, being authentically yourself, which I thought was great, the glass half full, which is probably a good way to think about women in leadership roles. Although I might take issue with the notion that if you bring more women in, it increases mental health in the workforce. That sounds like a controversial debate to get into. But I really thought there was some really brilliant stuff there and lots of lessons. I did want to finish before we wrap up on women in business. Just to give you an update from our point of view at the CBI about how that is going. You know, recent research from Cranfield shows that in aggregate, the FTSE 350 has met and exceeded the target set by the Hampton-Alexander review. But when you dig underneath the data, actually, you see something a bit different. It's a bit bifurcated. The gap is growing between those who really over-deliver, 60% mark for women on boards and more, and the laggards who are falling behind. So although the aggregate figure looks good, actually there's a real polarity within there, and the number of female executive directors is flatlining. And so we have been of the view that it's time to have a successor to the Hampton-Alexander review, to set a target now of 40% of women on boards and to keep pushing progress forward. We're also big fans of the gender pay gap reporting. We think it's been a game changer. It was sort of abandoned or suspended during the pandemic, but I think hopefully the government will indeed this month start to bring it back in. Look, we all know that diverse companies are better companies, but I think all of us have the concern, and we don't yet know how it's going to impact, that the pandemic has disproportionately had an impact on women in work, and I think therefore the lights go out. Could anything more go wrong? I think therefore we should continue to keep a watching brief on that. So look, I just wanted to thank our partners this evening, The Economist, Informer, and the University of Southampton for their continuing support. And I know that some of Helen's family are with us this evening. So I want to thank you for joining us and for doing everything you can to keep Helen's memory and legacy alive. Thank you, Sharon. You were fabulous. Thank you, Zanny. You too. And I wish everybody a lovely evening.
Thanks all.
Thank you all.